Welcome back. This is episode 8, part 2. Apparently, there were rules and customs that applied to pirate weddings, although they were quite different from those employed under more normal circumstances. The principals finally stood up and faced each other on the sandy beach and repeated to each other an approximation of the wedding vows. All hands seemed to consider the marriage quite binding. However, from that time forward, it was accepted without question that Calico Jack and Anne were husband and wife. Rackham kept his prenuptial promise to the letter. Maybe he was afraid not to. Anyway, the arrangement resulted in one of the most fantastic situations imaginable. Anne not only sailed with Rackham on his piratical cruises, she also took delight in donning a man's attire and participating in the actual hand-to-hand fighting and looting with as much gusto as any member of the crew. There were dark mutterings among some members of the crew about defying the ancient taboo against a woman on shipboard. Many were the predictions of disaster sure to follow if the practice was continued. It had its pleasanter side, though. Anne was a thoroughly dependable and trustworthy ally to have on a boarding party, and the meals she occasionally cooked for the crew were delicious beyond anything they normally had on board ship. Besides, Anne and Calico Jack were without doubt the two most deadly swordsmen in the entire motley aggregation. It could well have cost you your life to give offense to either of them. Some historians believe that all this time Anne was hoping against hope for an encounter with the crazy Captain Edward Lowe and a chance to even the score with him. He was not a member of the New Providence Society, and they never met at sea, so that chance was denied her. There was one instance, and so far as we know, only one, of near infidelity to mar this somewhat idyllic, if unlawful, relationship dedicated to violence and crime. Because of the inevitable toll of constant combat, Rackham's crew at one time was reduced in number to the point where it was difficult to man the ship in a storm, and where the outcome of a battle was becoming more and more doubtful. Being, above all else, a realist, Calico Jack then began to attack somewhat smaller ships, and to offer the conquered crewmen of those ships the choice of walking the plank or joining the pirate crew, with the promise of a full share of the booty. Understandably, many of those previously honest seamen took the blood oath and joined the Rackham crew, and many of them developed quite an aptitude for piracy and infused new energy into the company. One such converted merchant seaman was a young sailor who signed in blood with the name M. Reed. Lithe and agile, and with the smooth beardless cheek normally associated with the young, the sunburned youth immediately caught the fancy of Anne Bonny Rackham. There was a gentleness and a grace about this new crew member that stood out in sharp contrast to the bearing of the others. With her accustomed directness and openness, Anne began to pursue an attempt to court, in 100 different ways, this new object of her fascination. The fact that M. Reed seemed to shy away from her and avoid her advances only fanned the flame of her interest and made her redouble her efforts. The climax of this very one-sided affair occurred one warm starlit night when the pirate ship was anchored in the natural harbor of a beautiful Caribbean island. Most of the crew had gone ashore with Rackham in search of pigs which they seized from the natives. The pirates then proceeded to Buchan the half-wild porkers right there on the beach. Now, to Buchan a pig was the very same thing as barbecuing it, and the result of the Buchan was a delicious gustatory treat, of which pirates all over that region were very fond. In fact, boycons were so frequent that the pirates eventually became known as boyconeers. Ha! Imagine that, y'all. And this term later became, through much usage, simply buccaneers. Thus, a buccaneer was a heavily armed sea robber who came ashore on an island, stole the natives' pigs, and barbecued them on the beach. The boycon was usually concluded with a prolonged drinking spree, which left senseless and snoring on the sand all but a few assigned to guard the pirate ship. And so it was on the night of which we speak. Only Anne Bonny and 3 or 4 of the crew, M. Reed among them, remained on board the ship. Knowing that M. Reed was assigned the anchor watch and was thus unable to leave the deck of the pirate ship, Anne waited until the few members of the crew left aboard had settled down to sleep. Oh no, you guys. Oh no. All was calm and serene. The moon cast a beautiful glow over the deck, and Anne felt that her golden moment of opportunity was at hand. With a soft fire in her eyes, Anne Bonny moved in for the capture. Taking a seat beside the handsome young smooth-skinned sailor, the ardent lady pirate began to make a complete confession of her feelings for her younger shipmate. Quite eloquently did Anne argue her case, and quite directly and boldly, as was her wont. She was apparently oblivious to the danger that she might be overheard by a wakeful member of the crew, and her conduct reported to Rackham. All this while young Reed remained silent, indicating only by an occasional nervous movement of the head or a desperate sidelong glance overside that Anne's words were even heard, or if heard, were making any impression whatsoever. Finally, with a sigh of resignation, young Reed turned so that each was looking directly into the other's face, and made a disclosure that must have shaken Anne to her very corset stays. M. Reed was a woman also. Then, oh my God, M. Reed was a woman also. Then, in a veritable torrent of words, Mary Reed told how it had come about that she was also dressed in men's clothing and carrying out the duties of a merchant seaman. Now, she also became oblivious to the danger of being overheard. Now it was the silent one who felt the compulsion to talk until her full story was known to the other woman sitting there in stunned silence by her side. The tale she told was, if anything, more incredible than Anne Bonny's had been. Soon after her birth in England, Mary Reed's parents had decided to play a trick on her paternal grandmother by concealing the fact that the baby was a girl instead of the male heir the old lady had hopefully expected. Feeling that little Mary would be disinherited if it were learned that she was a girl, the parents did everything in their power to carry out the deception. They dressed her in boys' clothing, gave her the nickname Jack, and insisted that she learn and practice boys' games and pastimes. The deceit might have worked with the desired result, except for the fact that the old lady lived on, and her health got better with age. What had started as a calculated fraud resulted in the development of a muscular, active, and profane counterfeit of a young man of the lower middle class. Grandma really had cause to believe that her grandchild was a virile, strapping young man and she made occasional generous gifts to this favorite grandchild, but the bulk of her estate she kept in order to see to her own comfort and security. Bored with her life in England, Mary then decided that if she was going to have the name of a boy, she might as well have some of the fun boys are supposed to have. She hoped that her grandmother would believe all the more strongly that she was the male heir everyone assumed her to be, running away from home. The strapping youth enlisted in the infantry in Flanders and served out a full enlistment undetected. Disliking the constant marching, she then shipped out on an English merchant ship and got her first taste of life at sea, which from her standpoint as a cabin boy, she found less than attractive. After a year at sea, her ship docked again in Flanders, and she promptly jumped ship and re-enlisted in the Flemish armed services, this time in a regiment of cavalry. Then she felt she was in an occupation that suited her very well. She came to love the thrilling massed charges of the full brigade of horses, the stealthy thrill of picket duty on horseback, and the satisfying sense of being needed as she rubbed down her horse and cared for him and fed him. In those days, the acceptable standards of personal hygiene and sanitation were vastly different from minimum standards today. Even so, it is remarkable that her masquerade could have succeeded as long as it did, and that Jack Hawkins, guidon bearer for a regiment of horse, should have gone so long unrevealed. In the end, it was her own feminine nature which betrayed her. A dashing, handsome young cavalryman named Jack Reed, a man who seemed to epitomize the traits she admired in men, was transferred into her regiment. The better she knew him, the better she liked him. In due course, she confessed both her true sex and her affection for him. Reed must have been among the most startled of men. Cavalrymen, however, traditionally have a fine sense of balance, and when he recovered his aplomb, he discovered that he reciprocated Mary's feelings. Laying their plans well, the two sweethearts deserted their regiment just in time to catch a ship bound for the Carolina colonies. They were married on shipboard by the captain and traveled finally to Beaufort Town in North Carolina, where they set up a combination inn and tavern. They soon accumulated a fine stable of horses, and to show their love for things equine, they named their establishment the Three Horseshoes. It was the very inn at which Anne Bonny and her bridegroom had spent their honeymoon after running away from Anne's father. Now the two women's paths had crossed again, but under what different circumstances? Mary swore that she remembered Anne and her young husband, and that she had remarked at the time on what a handsome couple they made. She had not known what had finally become of Anne until the first day she saw her in woman's dress on the pirate's ship. From that day on, she had been much too frightened to reveal herself. Mary Reed's husband had died in Beaufort, and for a while she had operated the inn of Three Horseshoes by herself. But the work was more than she could handle alone, and the care of several horses was a burden to her. She longed for the old, carefree life of the sea, and thought of it more and more often. When she finally had a chance to sell the inn and the horses for a good price, she sold out, lock, stock, and barrel. Traveling to Portsmouth Island, she once again donned the male attire she knew so well and signed on a merchant ship as a seaman. M. Reed remained unsuspected and undiscovered until Anne's interest forced her disclosure. Thereafter, the two women became good friends, and Anne did not betray her new friend's secret until Calico Jack's jealousy made him suspicious of the tanned young sailor with whom Anne was often seen engaging in animated conversation. Poor Rackham. He had no way of knowing that it was only women talk between them. So he confronted the pair one day, dagger in hand, fully prepared to do violence to M. Reed. After first swearing him to secrecy, Anne and Mary revealed her secret to the pirate captain. Thunderstruck and speechless in his amazement, Calico Jack could only cover his confusion with roars of laughter. Rackham kept his vow of secrecy, and M. Reed was able to keep her place as a member of the crew, neither asking nor giving favor in the performance of all the tasks involved in the business of sea robbery. Legend has it that Anne Bonny and M. Reed frequently engaged in fencing matches with each other and so sharpened their skills with the dirk, the sword, and the pistol that the other crewmen held them not only in respect but in absolute fear. They never seemed to quarrel between themselves. Perhaps each had too much respect for the deadly skills of the other, or perhaps there was a bond of sympathy between them. Mary Reed was apparently content to continue her sham and live the life of a pirate crewman on board ship. When the buccaneers went ashore, she could not join fully in the roistering and wild drunken celebrating that went on. There was too much danger, she thought, that she would inadvertently reveal her true nature. Thus, Mary lived a rather lonely life when all around her were whooping it up, and she began too long once more for a more normal, womanly existence, even as a pirate. After all, Anne Bonny was a woman and was accepted without question, in spite of the ancient superstition that a woman was bad luck aboard a ship. But Anne had a husband, and that seemed to make all the difference. It seemed as though the gods of the sea took pity on Mary's plight. On the very next expedition, Rackham's ship captured a vessel manned by a youngish crew of better than average sailors. Appealing to the pirate captain, Mary chose one of the captured sailors as her full share of the prize. This was sometimes done by pirates who thenceforward held these slaves as enforced servants until it suited their pleasure to free them sometime years later. Mary had other ideas in mind for her prize. Imagine the astonishment of her slave when Mary got him ashore, disclosed her true sex to him, and then told him she intended to make him her husband. History does not tell us what, if any, alternative was offered the young captive, but whatever it was, he chose marriage to Mary Reed. From all accounts, this fellow was a gentle, mild sort of person, more given to books and philosophy than to burning and looting. Now Mary considered that she was almost on an equal footing with Anne Bonny Rackham. Now she, too, had a husband. After her true sex was revealed and accepted as Anne's had been, Mary and her bridegroom were allowed to sign on with Rackham's crew and put to sea with the promise of equal shares in any loot. But trouble developed almost immediately. Another pirate, one of the most hated and feared of the crew, promptly picked a quarrel with the new husband. A challenge to a duel to the death was quickly made and accepted. The alternative would have been a slit throat, but the prospect of a duel itself offered little more hope. Poor Mary. She knew full well that her new mate was no match for the other pirate and would probably be killed in the first passage at arms. If she had no husband, Calico Jack Rackham would probably not want her aboard. Her entire piratical career was hanging in the balance. With characteristic directness, Mary Read confronted her problem. Seeking out the challenging pirate, she demanded words with him. Smirking at what he thought would be her frantic pleas for her husband's life, and hurriedly calculating what profit he could make out of the situation. The bully agreed to the conference. How confused he must have been when the first thing the woman did was smack him with her open palm across his bearded face with all her considerable strength. Completely surprised and half blinded by the unexpected blow, the unsuspecting brigand struck back with his fists and thus sealed his own doom. Claiming mortal insult, Mary Read challenged him to a duel. Under the rules that governed such affairs at the time, she had the choice of the time and the place for the duel. Now, smiling self-confidently, she chose the beach of a nearby island as the place. And the time? She named the time as exactly 2 hours before the scheduled duel between her husband and that same pirate. For weapons, the unfortunate brigand chose both swords and pistols in close combat, but his fate was already decided, and he knew it. To his credit, be it said that he put up a good fight for a few minutes before Mary Read's skill prevailed. She allowed him the one shot from his pistol, which missed. Then she proceeded to cut him to ribbons before she finally killed him. She wanted to set an example that other would-be challengers of her husband would remember, and she succeeded. Calico Jack sent a burial party ashore, and that was that. Never again was the setup challenged, and the reputation of the two married couples mushroomed. The very unnaturalness of the situation sent chills of horror down the spine of many an honest seafarer. Tales of the cruelty and complete lack of pity evidenced by the two women were exaggerated and multiplied time and again. Rumor fed on rumor until the two women were thought to be very fiends of hell itself. This pleased them no end, as it was exactly the impression they wished most to convey. No matter what their other vices, the two women are said never to have indulged in strong drink, either ashore or afloat. It would have been better for them all if the other pirates had been abstainers too. At least they might have escaped capture longer. As it turned out, a British man of war sent out from Jamaica to look for this very pirate ship finally located the marauder laying at anchor off a beautiful little Caribbean island. Most of her pirate crew were roaring drunk below decks, with only Anne, Mary, and 2 or 3 others on deck. The Britisher came alongside before the pirate could get her anchors up. Grappling irons were thrown over the rail, and a boarding party of British Marines swarmed aboard. Even then, the buccaneers might have turned the tide if they had fought back. They heavily outnumbered their attackers and were skilled in such fighting, but they were in no condition to fight from Rackham on down. The sound of the battle on the decks over their heads struck terror in their drunken brains, and they cowered below in fright as the tide of the battle turned against those on deck. This so enraged Anne Bonny that she ran to an open hatchway, cursed them all for cowardly dogs, and then fired both her pistols into the hold, severely wounding several of her shipmates. All hands were either killed or quickly captured, and the two women were overpowered and put in leg irons. At the time of their capture, both Anne and Mary were wearing attack clothes, huge baggy trousers, and heavy mannish blouses with scarves tied about their heads. Their captors did not suspect their sex, and the women did not reveal it to them. The British chief magistrate having been sent over from England only recently, did not suspect their true sex either, and no one seems to have informed His Honor. Anne Bonny and Mary Read maintained their disguise throughout the entire trial in Port Royal. When the trial reached its predictable conclusion and Calico Jack Rackham was sentenced to be hanged in chains, His Majesty's chief legal officer in the islands turned his bewigged head to the others standing huddled in the well of the court with a sarcastic edge to his voice. He asked if any of the others had anything to say concerning the question of whether they also should not be awarded a similar fate. His Honor's eyebrows went up almost into his wig, and his mouth dropped open in consternation as he beheld the youthful figures of two young pirates stride impertinently forward to address him. What possible reason could you two young scoundrels have to offer this court as to why you should not be hanged by the neck until you are dead? Roared the chief magistrate, matching the judicial officer stare for stare and scowl for scowl. Anne Bonny tossed her head defiantly and replied, "Your Majesty, we pleads our bellies." The shout of raucous laughter that went up from the pirates fairly made the rafters ring. Here was raw courage in the face of certain doom, and a broad joke to end it all with. This the brigands could appreciate, and each identified himself at the moment with the defiant Anne. This was the rabbit spitting in the hound dog's face. His lordship turned white with anger, pointing a trembling finger at the two lonely figures standing before him. He asked, "What is the meaning of this impertinence? Have you no fear of the hereafter?" "Right is right, your Majesty," replied Anne. "Ye knows the English law as gooder than we does. Ye knows it's against the law to kill an unborn child, and an English child at that. We both be pregnant, and ye cannot hang us." Examination proved her to be right. Both Anne Bonny Rackham and Mary Read were in a family way and under English law, could not be executed until after the birth of their children. But the other pirates had no such excuse and were not to escape. A few days before Calico Jack's execution, Anne was allowed to visit him in his cell. Far from offering any condolences or consolation, Anne viewed her husband with contempt. "If ye had only fought like a man when the Britishers boarded us," she said, "ye might have died like a man instead of being hanged like a dog." With that, she turned and flounced out of the cell. It was the last time she ever saw him. Some time later, on the appointed day, Calico Jack Rackham, dressed in his bright and colorful calico trousers, was hanged in chains at high noon in the public square of Port Royal. His male crewmen were similarly dispatched a few minutes later, not only as a punishment for their crimes, but as a deterrent to others who might be tempted to go pirating. Unlike Anne, Mary Read pleaded for her husband both at and after the trial, swearing that the two of them had intended to forsake a life of piracy and settle down ashore. She begged clemency, but in vain. It did her no good to plead that she herself was responsible for forcing her husband into piracy, and that he had no choice in the matter. He was hanged with the rest of them. Mary contracted a fever soon after this and died in prison. Attended to the end of Anne Bonny. Her child was never born. Mary's remains rest to this day in the beautiful little cemetery in Port Royal, where the soft trade winds blow over her grave and the tropic sun she loved so much shines down with a languorous warmth. She is remembered as Poor Mary Read by the islanders. True to her colors to the end, she is said to have remarked shortly before her death that it was good that the penalty for piracy was death by the gallows. Otherwise, she said, every cowardly milksop from here to hell might be led to try to belong to the Brotherhood of the Sea, since there would be no real penalty. Anne Bonny was never hanged so far as is known. Transferred to the gaol in New Bern in the province of Carolina, she was delivered of her child in safety. Through the influence of her father's friends, she received stay after stay of execution, and was allowed to keep her baby in the gaol with her. Finally, she was pardoned altogether and left the New Bern gaol a free woman. What happened to her after that is anyone's guess. Did she give away her red-headed baby boy and go back to sea to resume her piratical ways? Did she settle down in coastal Carolina and end her days as a midwife or a charwoman? Did she ever inherit any of her father's considerable wealth, or was it all used up in buying her pardon? These and many more such questions will probably remain forever unanswered. Anne Bonny fades from sight with her release from prison and her pardon from the king. Perhaps she found peace and some degree of happiness in her old age. Perhaps, just perhaps, that beautiful young raven-haired girl you saw helping her father with his shrimp trawl in Core Sound has the blood of Anne Bonny in her veins. It is entirely possible.